C.S. Lewis's book called The Abolition of Man. He makes this case that, what looks like a simple lesson on maybe English grammar, that what is actually at stake is anthropology and philosophy and theology, right? And so we've seen this with standardized testing company after standardized testing company. It's now using assessment to drive sometimes very ideological stuff.
Here we go. Welcome to The Way is Love on the Focusing Way podcast. I'm your host, David Battistella. Find The Focusing Way on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. To access bonus content and extras, subscribe at thefocusingway.com. We all, in one way or another, have been tested. Tests are designed to help us to know where we are, but they can also act as a goal and provide a marker of sorts in our progress toward an education or knowledge about something. Tests and testing are also an important passageway toward the next level of our education as we learn and grow. We have no doubt heard of the S.A.T test that many universities require for admission. Students and parents alike sweat over the scores obtained on these tests. Well, what if these tests were flawed, or even by design could lead students away from a specific type of education and in another direction entirely? A test is something one prepares for and tunes their learning accordingly toward the end goal, which is to attain a high score. Tests move us toward learning required for a successful test result. To use an athlete analogy, an arm wrestler would prepare differently from the test of facing another arm wrestler than the way a tennis player or a hockey player would prepare for their opponent. With me today to talk about tests is the inventor of the classic learning test, Jeremy Tate. And joining me now is Jeremy Tate, CEO of Classic Learning Test. Jeremy, welcome to the Focusing Way podcast.
Hey, David, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be with you today.
Let's just start, just so people have an overview here. What are classic learning and the classic learning test?
Absolutely. There's a renaissance happening, I believe, in American education, rediscovering traditional education and really kind of the aims, the goal of traditional education, which really didn't change much for more than 2,000 years, going back to Aristotle and Plato, the Republic, all the way till really the beginning of the 20th century. The basic goal of education, really was the cultivation of virtue, the development of good character, morals, a life of discipline. And you had at the center of that the pursuit of truth, goodness, and beauty. And that was replaced really in the 20th century by kind of a utilitarian focus, right? This whole idea that we shouldn't learn something unless kids are going to use it, which quickly eliminates art and philosophy and classical literature, many of the things that cultivate wonder and curiosity. So we launched, what we did is we launched an alternative to the S.A.T and the E.C.T out of this conviction that the tests end up actually driving the curriculum. And that if these important tests, if they require students to read, let's say George MacDonald or Catherine of Siena, Flannery O'Connor, then that is going to kind of force its way into the classroom as well. So we wanted to combine that also with just kind of giving students a much better experience. For decades in the U.S., students have given up an entire Saturday to go and take a really meaningless test that takes up about 5 or 6 hours when it's all said and done. CLT, you take it at home, you read what we believe, is the very best of what has been thought and said, as the English poet Matthew Arnold put it. And you do it in 2 hours from home. You get your results back in just a few days.
Wow. But what really sort of prompted you, besides what you just cited there, but what was driving you to really create the classic learning test?
Yeah, really, I think it was kind of born out of an experience in seminary. I graduated from college in 2004. I taught in inner city New York for 3 years. And one of the thoughts I had from that experience is that we weren't really addressing the needs of the students. This was a community where the students were experiencing a lot of suffering, right? Very few of them had intact families. They were inhabiting a world full of suffering And in no way were we addressing questions of meaning or human happiness. It was just not part of the education at all. And so I think that was the beginning of kind of rethinking, first principles in education. Like, what are we doing here? What is the point of all of this? And then really, 2015, fast forward 10 years, I was working at a Catholic school that was very much focused on Christ, the school my daughters go to now, a really great school. But, David, there was a tension there, I think, with the College Board. The College Board is the most powerful education company in America. And really, a lot of what we did at that school, and it's a great school, but a lot of what we did for marketing, for getting new students to compete with other Catholic high schools, we're using all things connected to the College Board to market, right? Average PSAT score, average SAT score, how many AP classes we were offering, on and on and on. And so much so that when these Dominican sisters who run the school, they introduced an intro to philosophy, an intro to Christian apologetics, there weren't very many students that were interested in taking these classes. And I remember talking to some of them, and the students said, "Well, Mr. Tate, they're not 5 AP quality points. They're not College Board classes, right?"
Yeah.
And so it was like, how did we get in this situation where we have what I would describe as an aggressively secular testing company kind of calling the shots at our Catholic high school in Catonsville, Maryland, and so yeah, it's been, we launched in 2005 with really this kind of impossible idea of, let's take on the beast, let's take on the most powerful education company in America with what we believe is a greater vision for education that is ultimately focused on human flourishing and the things that really matter.
What are the kind of problems you were noticing with standardized testing?
Yeah, a couple. And the SAT and ACT in particular, I'll speak about first. But what they did in 2014-15 is they aligned with something called the Common Core state standards. Now, if you've heard anything about Common Core, some of the things people generally know is that it's generally a turning away from fiction and towards what they call informational text, right? Now, by informational text, I think they mean kind of one-sided, often kind of government documents as informational text. But think about this for a minute. What is it that really cultivates, a love for reading in young people, right? It's not informational text, right? Typically it's fiction, right? It's great stories. Students, when children get immersed in great stories, then they develop a great love for reading. So the fact that the Common Core is actually limiting the amount of fiction in favor of these informational texts, it's a big problem. In addition to that, it's a bias against the classics. It's especially a bias against religious text. And the math is kind of new math that is very different from the traditional kind of math, that nearly every generation, before was doing. So these are some of the big differentiators.
I just want to take a little bit of a step back here, because it's like, just really, how important is it for people to understand what's kind of going on under the hood, as it were, with tests, the questions and the kind of learning those tests force people into?
Yeah, David, it's a great question. I mean, in some ways, standardized testing is so boring that it's easy to fly under the radar. Like, a lot of people are like, they got to take some standardized tests. Who cares, right? But standardized testing, it actually conveys to students in a very powerful way, like what's actually important, right? And if you think about it, if you're a fan of C.S. Lewis and C.S. Lewis's book called The Abolition of Man, in the beginning of The Abolition of Man, he's talking about something called the Green Book. And the Green Book, if you've read it, that's a familiar reference. But he makes this case that, what looks like a simple lesson on maybe English grammar, that what is actually at stake is anthropology and philosophy and theology, right? And so we've seen this with standardized testing company after standardized testing company. It's now using assessment to drive sometimes very ideological stuff, right? I've seen test questions before about, the number, a math word problem, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's asking, okay, the number of non-binary, versus cisgender students in the classroom, right? Well, the student is doing a math word problem, but it's communicating something that is norming something that before wasn't normative for most students. So standardized testing is being used again as kind of a lever to drive really a new ideology that a lot of parents are not comfortable with.
I'm seeing that in very popular apps like Duolingo, for example, where, all of a sudden in the video game like questions coming at language learning, all kinds of things are being inserted into
Sure.
those
Yeah.
questions, which prompt ideas or begin to drive a narrative, if you want to put it in that way.
Yeah.
But there's kind of an absence of. It feels like there's an absence of virtue. I don't want to say there is, but it feels that way. It feels like there's an absence of teaching logic, of teaching reason. So, what does the classic learning test respond to? Is it really responding to this
Yeah, man,
lack?
that's a great question. And David, by the way, I've seen yeah. I wanted to comment as well, though. I do Duolingo as well. I do it every day, but I was doing it at first with my 9-year-old boy, and yeah, it was he's 9, and we were doing this sweet thing together, father and son, learning a language together, and then we're doing it one night, and it's David and Ruben, going on a date together, and my son is saying, isn't Ruben a boy as well? And I'm saying, well, I didn't want to have that conversation at that point with my 9-year-old son. Duolingo doesn't need to do that. You could, come up with another name where it would leave that question open, rather than trying to kind of drive that. And for a lot of young users as well, it's a great example of how the testing, can push, Duolingo would never say, hey, we're in this arena. They would just say, we just do language. But what Duolingo is also doing is they completely eliminate. I've been doing it for well over a year. I've never learned anything about the language of the church. You don't even learn the word ecclesia, right, on Duolingo. It completely censors the tradition that has been most important to Spanish culture, right?
Yeah.
And with that omission, they're doing something very powerful and I think pretty sinister, And I missed that follow-up question.
Yeah, no, it's just this whole thing of virtue, and why from your assessment, you look at this stuff closely. Why do you think virtue and reason have been either removed or considered unimportant or less important when it comes to these tests that are basically gateways to higher education?
Sure. Yeah. And I think part of it is, actually you've got to think about motive, right? And so and this may sound radical to just raise this question, but I think if you think out loud for a second, you say, okay, what would the motive of government controlled education be in creating truly free, independent thinkers, right? Would the government have a vested interest, if it's going to be government education in the U.S., in developing free thinkers, people who can step back and, really question government, as well? I think that's part of the problem. We've seen logic disappear, the teaching of logic disappear, grammar, rhetoric, the study of classical languages completely gone, the study of philosophy completely gone. Students graduate high school, they've never even heard the word ethics before. They certainly haven't heard the word theology or probably philosophy, right? So, we're in a very new world in that everything that for millennia was defined education, right? Imagine trying to tell Frederick Douglass or Ben Franklin, that we've achieved universal free education, but we removed philosophy and we removed classical languages, we removed penmanship, we removed ethics, we removed religion. They'd be like, well, what is it then? Like they would have no reference point for what we were actually doing if we've removed kind of the meat and potatoes, right?
You end up with kind of the Henry Ford education model where, everyone who was coming to work at his factory was living in a subdivision that he possibly may have built. And then the children were being educated in schools in sort of how to become auto workers. So why this fear of free thinking? Why this fear of what is taught? What is the material? As you look at that material, as you revisit it yourself on a daily basis, as you look at it in order to put it into a testing model so that it's learned, because you have to reverse engineer the test in a sense, right? This is what people are doing. What are you discovering about what's been taken out?
It's a great question. It's a great question. Education can never, ever, ever be, values neutral, right? And I think that's something that people in the kind of mainstream education world have been claiming for a long time. Is we're just teaching math, we're just teaching English, but the reality is education can never be. And so, if previous generations, what they were going after was inspiring heroic virtue. I mean, that's how the history began, right? As a discipline of studying history, it was to inspire previous generations, with the great feats, of kind of their ancestors, what they had done. We're still doing a kind of morality in school. It's just kind of a new morality. It's a new religion with the highest possible virtue now being, something like tolerance, so long as it's not tolerance for, Christians, or often, people who have a particular view of monogamous, marriage between a man and a woman. No tolerance there, but tolerance to everything else. That's kind of the new supreme virtue, that's being taught. And so that is why, and David, we've been exposing this recently. The one of the most widely used elementary school tests for kindergartners even is called NWEA MAPS testing. Even the majority of Catholic elementary schools that I know have used NWEA MAPS testing. On their recommended reading list for kindergarten, pre-K 5-year-olds is The Drag Queen's Dress Goes Swish, Swish, Swish. This is for 5-year-olds, right? And the reason is because, and they're very clear about this, it teaches them to celebrate uniqueness, right? To celebrate, diversity. Now, nobody wants to push back on diversity, and it's very, very hard to in any way, right? And so everybody's afraid to say, maybe we shouldn't be teaching 5-year-olds about, this very new ideology, right? Everybody's afraid to say that because nobody wants to push back on diversity, because then you're, transphobe or whatever else is going to say. But it's gone far enough where, and even my company, the Classic Learning Test, we're a third of the company is centrist Democrats, and all of them say, no, this is too far. You can't be putting this kind of stuff in front of 5-year-olds. It's not right. They should be reading, fairy tales. They should be reading, Grimm's fairy tales, Hansel and Gretel, these stories that, have been around for centuries.
That sort of brings me to a question, a very important question about innocence and at what age we should be. Neil Postman wrote about this, obviously, in the 90s, and but there's an age at which we need to sort of, I'll put the question out there, do we need to protect our young children up to a certain point from the horrors of the world? And there might be a school of thinking that is, the sooner the better, and the better they, the sooner they find out about it, the better off they'll be. And there's another school of thinking that says, wait, I have every right to protect my child's innocence for as long as that age of innocence can last. His argument at the time was, you had young adults, early adulthood, and then some people didn't actually try and get into the adult secrets, the secrets of adulthood, until they were 20. And so, that age now, you're sort of bringing that down to 5, which is pre-Middle Ages. Like the Middle Ages was 7-year-olds entering the workforce and things like that. And so, just how does it all fit with what, how we're educating children now? How does it fit with the societies we're looking to build?
Yeah. One of the things that I love so much about classical education is that it really is rooted in wonder. And one of the great tragedies of kind of the factory model of schooling is that it tends to be kind of wonder and soul crushing for a lot of children, right? Some of the things I see happening with classical schools and classical homeschooling, things like stargazing, gardening, immersion into nature, right? These are things that you don't have to be, and I don't think it matters where you are on a political spectrum. I think most people would say, yeah, it's probably great for kids to gaze at the stars every once in a while. It's probably good for kids to hike and to see a stream. to plant a garden, to see animals, right? I think in some ways, this movement is a return to sanity, and a return to innocence, as well, right? Is there, anything more exciting, than watching, children as they see, a fish, swimming in a pond, or a turtle, or, any of that. So, yeah, and look, it may sound a bit dour, a bit pessimistic, I think, given where we're at, but I think the future is going to be very bright, with American education. I really do. I mean, we're at the beginning of recovering what I think, David, was almost lost in this tradition.
What kind of things are children going to learn while they're preparing for the classic learning test?
Sure. The big difference is going to be, what we would call source material, right? So source material means, what are you actually putting on this test? And so CLT, unlike the SAT and ACT, we go back all the way to Aristotle. We go back to Plato's Republic, right? We go back, and students may be reading St. Augustine when they practice. They may be reading Thomas Aquinas, or Flannery O'Connor, or Tolkien, or Lewis, or Mark Twain, right? They're reading from the classics, and with that, they're developing kind of a fluency in the tradition, not just the tradition that gave birth to America, but the tradition that really gave birth to the West as well. And something that has struck me is that while in the United States, we have these kind of canon wars right now, and a lot of the Iliad and the Odyssey being canceled and whatnot. At the same time, this tradition is being discovered in other parts of the world. In India, absolutely. In Africa, classical education is going bananas in Africa, right? They can't get enough of this kind of education. And look, any parent, when they're presented with the two options between kind of mainstream progressive schooling and classical education, every parent, again, across the political spectrum, they say, yeah, I want my kid to hear great stories. I want them to be developed in virtue and being honest and trustworthy and, doing the right thing. You want the moral compass to be sharpened. It's what a really good education does. So, the kind of passages we put on the CLT lend themselves to that.
Mm. I mean, more people, we're seeing this, especially in recent years, are moving to homeschooling over what's being offered in the public system. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, the explosion of homeschooling, I mean, just the numbers, let's talk about that for just 1 second here. But in the U.S., 1973, there were 13,000 homeschoolers in America, right? 13,000 in a country that had at the time about 200 million or so, right? Today, the population is almost doubled, not quite, but homeschooling has gone from 13,000 to well over 5 million. During that time, right? Less than 50 years has gone from 13,000 to well over 5 million. And what's really interesting to me, David, about this is that it's actually grown more. It's grown the most among Black families, actually. The number one demographic right now for homeschooling are Black families in America, over 15%. And the achievement gap is the sharpest between Black homeschool students and Black public school students. The reading gap is over 40% difference in reading comprehension tests between Black homeschooled students and Black public school students. Wow. And that's why the secret's getting out. We're at 15% now. Could it be 30% in a couple of years? Very possibly, right? So homeschooling continues. And, the big argument against homeschooling for a very long time was, well, does the mom or dad know chemistry? Do they know, French? Do they know, advanced math? Well, now the student can access the very best French teacher in the world. They can access the very best math teacher in the world, because of online learning options. So really, the things that were leveled against homeschooling for a long time, I think now become some of homeschooling's, greatest claims.
What advice do you give parents who want to educate their children in classic education?
Yeah, I think, it's never too young to start, and you don't have to immediately, move your kid out of the public school right to start classical education. The first thing you should do, buy a copy of Aesop's Fables, right? That's a great place to start, everybody knows these stories, the tortoise and the hare. I remember that. It's interesting. I didn't discover this kind of education until about 8 years ago. And at the time, my boys, I've got 6 kids, but my boys at the time were, 2 and 4 about. And, started bringing home Grimm's fairy tales and Aesop's Fables. And kids know the difference. And they did not want to read the other stuff. I always read to them. But as soon as we introduced, Aesop's Fables, they want to read The Tortoise and the Hare again and again and again and again and again. These stories are classics because every generation has said yes. Like, that is worth passing down. They've stood the test of time because they're just inherently, objectively better, right? And if this generation produces something that's timeless, I think we can trust further generations to pass that down as well. But what we've been given, Aesop's Fables is more than 2,000 years old, right?
Yeah.
The tortoise and the hare, the dog and his bone, the bull and the ant. These are stories that children have loved for generations.
Why do you think state colleges should begin to accept classic learning tests as their entrance bar, the bar for their...
Yeah, I mean, typically what it means for a lot of colleges when they adopt is it means, an influx of new applicants. And so, 88% of our students, they're coming from great charter schools, great classical schools, great home schools. And so what we're seeing is that these students, they get to campus and often they make some of the very best students in class. They're engaged, they do their homework. They tend to not be the kind of kids causing problems on campus as well. It's typically not your well-churched homeschool kid who, goes and wreaks havoc and gets arrested on the lawn and whatever else, they tend to be just good, wholesome kids. And I think a lot of colleges really desire that right now. In some ways, just being normal is in very short supply at the moment. And I think a lot of colleges like CLT students for that reason. Another reason I think colleges really like accepting, the CLT is it can be a way to double down on what they actually care about, right? It makes sense at a college like Thomas Aquinas or Benedictine or Hillsdale or Grove City. It makes sense that they would use a college entrance exam that actually reflects the kind of education that they're offering at the college, right? Whereas the SAT and ACT are completely disconnected from that kind of education.
You're a parent, you're a father, you've just mentioned you have 6 children. What is the response you are getting, like personally, from parents who decide to take their children on this pathway?
Yeah, everybody right now is in a place of discovering this tradition. It's very rare that you meet somebody that was like, oh yeah, I was classically educated growing up. We're all kind of in this renaissance together where some of us discovered it 2 years ago, some of us discovered it 10 years ago, but that makes it kind of special, in that none of us are experts. We're all learning together. We're in this, you picture the imagery of an archaeological dig. We're discovering all of these gems as a group together. So it's just a lot of fun. I think classical education has given birth or kind of rebirth to kind of new communities that extend far beyond the school. A classical school, I've noticed, you go to a place like the Regent School of Austin or the Veritas School of Richmond. These aren't just schools. These are communities, that have gathered around this life-giving, culture-enhancing, culture-enriching, way of learning. So it's an exciting time, David.
Wow. Thank you so much for your time today. Our guest has been Jeremy Tate. He's the CEO of Classic Learning Test. And if you get a chance, get over there and check it out because there's a lot of great information there. Jeremy, thank you so much for your time today.
Hey, David, it's an honor to be on the show. Thank you.
You have been listening to The Way is Love on the Focusing Way podcast. Like, comment, and subscribe on YouTube. Or go to thefocusingway.com and subscribe for bonus content and extras.